All right, tonight another Q&A session about the Kee Bird. My name is Ken Stano with the YouTube channel History X. So this is our third Q&A session, and I really appreciate you guys sending all of your questions my way. Those that hit me up at the email address ken@historyxchannel.com. Those are the ones that we're going to be hitting tonight. There's been some repeats, and I figured, you know what? We got to get some of these out of the way. I was actually going to wait until next week to do another Q&A session, but there's just way too many questions. They're all great questions, fantastic questions. So let's dive right in. All right, let me get rid of that. Let's see. A couple days ago, I did a part 3, a review of the British version, not the PBS version, not the Nova version, but the British version of the documentary called Treasure on the Humboldt Glacier. And so that has all kinds of additional footage that we all haven't seen before. It's fascinating. But one of the questions that keeps popping up is, when it comes to the 50 caliber machine guns that were on the Kee Bird, and I believe there were at least 10 of them. Okay. What happened to them? Did they get shipped back to Thule? Are they still up there? So here's an example. This isn't actually a picture of the Kee Bird. This is a picture of another B29. But I wanted to highlight the turret on top of the fuselage just behind the cockpit. And you can see here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 50 caliber machine guns. Okay. So now check out the Kee Bird. And you know what? Let me get my image out of the way. Okay. So here are the 50 caliber machine guns that were in the turret, top of the fuselage, as the Kee Bird is getting pulled out of the lake. Okay. Remember that. Now, here is a picture of the Kee Bird as it sits in 1995. So this would have been at the end of the quote unquote first season, when they replaced all 4 engines, hung all 4 props, but they ran out of time. Rick, the mechanic, was in bad health, so they had to get the hell out of there. Now, take a look at the turret on top of the fuselage. Don't worry, I've got this zoomed in, okay? On the left, 1994, when they're pulling out of the lake, the 50 cals are there. Oh, geez, and my image is blocking the screen again. Hold on a second. Let me get me out of there. All right. Now, in 1995, they're all gone. They've all been removed. Okay, so that answers one question, in effect, right? What happened to the 50 cals? Well, they were removed. And the main reason for that is because of weight. They had a short, soggy runway to deal with. That B29 bomber, Kee Bird, had to be as light as possible. All right. But what it doesn't answer is, where are they? Did they get shipped back to Thule? Are they still up there, buried in the ground, buried in the tundra, like the original propeller blades are? Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that question. So what I've done, it's a repeat question, like I said, and I've been scouring photos. I've been looking at different images, and this is what I came up to talk about that question. So I was able to answer part of it, but it's still open-ended because we don't know where they are. And I think one of the ways we're going to get an answer to that is, and I've mentioned this before, I've been in touch with a lot of the members of the Kee Bird expedition, Bob Vanderveen, Vernon Rich, 2 of the more prominent ones. And when we have Bob Vanderveen on, we've got to nail him with that question. What happened? Where are the 50 caliber machine guns? All right. Let's see. Taking a look. Let's see who's joining us tonight. San Francisco Bay. Let's stop the speculation and deal with the facts about the Kee Bird. I don't, that's pretty funny. We want to deal with facts. Where the hell's my book? Oh yeah. So I've got Carl Hoffman's book right here. But a lot of it's also speculation, right? Because we're never going to know what was going through Daryl Greenemeyer's mind because Daryl has passed away. But we're going to do the best we can. Lego History Sam's joining us. Matthew Cox, your comments are going to be in the lower right-hand corner, guys. So hit me with your comments. Hit me with your questions. Let's see. Always love hearing about this beautiful plane. Definitely. Let's see. David Atkins says, one of the pics Gary Larkins provided in the other videos of the dump pile, I believe you can see an intact a lower 50 cal barrel in the lower aft turret. All right, we're going to have to take a look at that. Maybe not tonight, but I'm going to dig into that one. Because you guys are scrutinizing these images just like I am. So let me know what you found. And San Francisco's base says, when it comes to the 50 cals, probably removed and dumped because the rescuers were not allowed to be in possession of them. Yeah, we talked about that before, didn't we? Thule Air Base. I think Lieutenant, he was either a Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel Cox who was in charge. Probably wouldn't have let them bring 50 caliber machine guns onto the base, whether they were serviceable or not. So I have a feeling, just like the original propeller blades, due to weight, they didn't bring those back on the Caribou. They're going to load the Caribou up with trash, up with junk, something that can't be used. They did load the Caribou up with the 4 original engines because those could be sold and rebuilt. But old bent up propeller blades, no. 50 caliber machine guns, probably not. And just like the propeller blades, they're probably buried up at the Kee Bird site. That is my guess. And that's all it is a guess. So we've got to ask, we got to get it straight from one of the expedition members. And when we have them on, we'll hit them with that question. You know what? Before we dive in, here's an interesting question right here. San Francisco Bay. Where was the Kee Bird going to land? Well, it was going to land at Thule, no doubt about it, because that's the closest place that they could make. Also, you combine that with the fact that the well, I'm not so sure. At the time, Gary Larkins, who had secured the permits, at the time, he had the full cooperation of the Air Force. And they said, yeah, you can put the Kee Bird in one of the old B-52 hangars, even though the floor was sagging and it was no longer usable by a B-52. If you're going to disassemble the Kee Bird or park it in a portion of the hangar where the floor wasn't sagging, that's where they were going to go. Thule Air Force Base, no doubt about it. Now, from there, I'm not so sure. But, you get this thing airborne, you got to go to the closest place. All right. So next question that I wanted to hit. And this was an email I received from Gavin O'Sullivan out of Ireland. Gavin did order Carl Hoffman's book, and he sent me a nice email the other day saying that he received it and he was going to start reading it. I strongly recommend, if you guys want to dig into a fascinating story, learn more facts about the Kee Bird, get Carl Hoffman's book, Hunting Warbirds. All right, so Gavin asked the question, did Daryl and Gary Larkins ever talk after the event? Now, to review, Gary Larkins was the guy that was behind all of the permits. You can't just go up into northern Greenland and do whatever you want. It's a colony of Denmark. So Gary Larkins had to get all the permits, and he'd been doing it since, I think, 1979, writing to and petitioning the Danish government. So Gary, and I've got a picture. Let's see here. In this picture of the 1993 expedition, this did not appear in the NOVA documentary. You've got Daryl, Rick Kriege, who we all know. Daryl brought his father, who was 80 years old. This is Gary Larkins right here. Weegee Smith, Tommy Hoffman, the Huey helicopter pilot right here. But Gary Larkins was in it from the very beginning, and he was there in 1993 to do an assessment as to whether or not the Kee Bird was going to be salvageable. So at the time, they were playing nice. At the time, they were working well together for the most part. But Gary Larkins had his hands in so many different warbird recovery projects, he didn't have enough money to tackle this. I mean, this is the king of all of them, right? And he didn't have enough money to tackle this one by himself. So he needed a partner, and that was Daryl Greenemeyer. And eventually, Gary got forced out. And like we talked about in the last Q&A, after Daryl, you know what? I wonder if I have a picture. After Daryl and the crew left the Kee Bird site after it burned to the ground. Let's see. So I got to go to this picture right here. Bear with me. Okay. When they left it in such a site like this, the Danish government, they were pissed. And they said, well, who's on the permit? Well, it's Gary Larkins, because Daryl never transferred it and transferred the name of the permit from Gary to Daryl. And so the Kee Bird site was left in this condition. The Danish government was pissed, and they ordered Gary Larkins up there to clean it up. Otherwise, they were going to pull some of his other permits for recovering other planes. So you would think, going back to, and let's see. I apologize for flipping through my slides this way, but for some reason, the file got deleted and I had to do it this way. But anyway, so to get to Gavin's question, did Daryl and Gary ever talk after the event? You would think Gary Larkins would be pretty upset, but actually Gary looked at Daryl's effort as, well, at least he tried. So that's kind of like taking the high road. But as far as I know, and according to Gary Larkins, in after looking through his emails, because Gary emailed me quite a bit, there was no mention that they ever talked ever again. And, I can't say that I blame him. Let's see. All right, before we move on to the next question, which has to do with, we talked about Daryl and Gary Larkins, not talking again, as far as I know. The next question had something to do with, do we know who Daryl had sold the airframe to? Who was the buyer that Daryl had lined up, that he was going to sell the Kee Bird to once he got it back to North America? I don't know who the eventual buyer was, and it's not spelled out in the book written by Carl Hoffman. But what we do know is that one of Daryl's partners was a guy by the name of Asher Ward. Asher Ward, and I can't find a current picture of this guy, but I have talked to him. He is an unusual character. Asher Ward is an aircraft broker, and Asher Ward had lined up a buyer. So while we don't know who the airframe was sold to, we at least know that there was a buyer lined up, and that buyer was lined up by Asher Ward. So Gavin, I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Before I get to the next question that I have lined up here, let's take a look at some of your comments. Let's see. This is an interesting one, because I've always thought this. Could at least some of the artifacts from the Kee Bird be displayed in a museum? At least part of the story can be shared with the public. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. Is that a picture of the SS United States? Or what's the name of the ship? Yeah, the SS United States. Is that, Matt, is that a picture of the United States right there as your logo, which is about to be sunk as a reef? Anyway, let me know. Let's see. There's a lot of souvenirs out there. Well, heck, I've even got some of them. Not necessarily from the Kee Bird, but Bob Vanderveen sent me, sent me a couple of hats that were left over from the Kee Bird expedition. So that's not necessarily from the Kee Bird, but it's from the expedition. And he also sent me a t-shirt. So, but I've received a couple of emails. I forget who the one of the guys that sent me an email has a picture, or he sent me a picture of one of the instruments from the Kee Bird sitting on his bookshelf. And I think he got it from Gary Larkins, so there's bits and pieces of stuff all over the place. Lawrence Dodds, one of the Nova cameramen, was telling me that he actually threw some parts from the original propellers that weren't going to be reused. He threw some parts from the original propellers in his pocket and he took them home. He lost them when he moved years later. But I guess my point is there's all kinds of souvenirs, artifacts around. Could they ever be gathered up and put in a museum? I don't know, but boy, you sure would like to think that people would want to see that. I would. I'd want to see that. I'm sure Vernon Rich has stuff. That's a great question. Let's see. Is Thule a military airport? Yes, it is. U.S. Air Force in cooperation with the Danish government. So no base commander is going to allow machine guns in case they go off accidentally and kill a military member. Absolutely. That's kind of the way I look at it. However, what isn't really spelled out, I can't remember if it's mentioned in the book, but Bob Vanderveen, Vernon Rich, I think Matt Jackson, those guys all told me that they had guns up there. They had guns up there because there's polar bears and other wild animals up there. You can see, and I think in the 2014 expedition, there was a group of guys, I think 3 guys that landed up there up at the site of 2014. You can go on YouTube and see their video of them climbing on the wing. I think they also had images. The guy's name is Mike Hjorth, I believe, and I've traded emails with him, and he sent me some images of some pretty big paw prints up there. So they had guns. The guys had guns on Thule that they were taking up to the Kee Bird site for protection. I don't know if the Air Force knew that or not. But San Francisco Bay makes a valid point. No base commander is going to allow machine guns. So the 50 cals are probably still up there. Do we know why Daryl couldn't just wait for next summer to get it out? Bring it was most ready late in the winter. Oh, being it was most okay. Yeah. I think what it boiled down to is when they went back up there, when Daryl went back up there with not a completely new crew, but additional guys, Thad Doolin, John Cater, Matt Jackson, they went up there in the winter. You had a situation where, like we said earlier, and it relates to the earlier question, there was a buyer. Daryl was already past his schedule of 3 to 4 weeks. So I'm sure he had to deliver the plane. Plus, he's, let's see, chartering Twin Otter aircraft. That's money. So he was out of money. He had to deliver the plane. That's why he couldn't, and he wasn't going to wait for the summer. He had given up on the summer. Someone else had emailed me a question about this. It's like, okay, why in the first season on the Nova documentary are they there in August, quote unquote, the summer up there, and then the second season, all of a sudden there's snow everywhere? What the hell? Well, so he was always concerned about the condition of the runway in August, end of August. It's still rainy, waterlogged, and it was really soggy. The conditions for the runway really soggy. So the reason they went back up in the winter for that next portion of the recovery effort was because he wanted to take off from the frozen lake. He wanted to clear all the snow off the frozen lake, figuring the lake would be at least, I think, 2 to 3 feet thick, 24 to 36 inches thick. and he wanted to take off from that surface. So he wasn't going to wait for next summer, but he could have waited for a following winter, right? But I think at that particular point, he had all 4 engines running. They were running well, and he wanted to go. You know, if you wait till next summer, you got to bring up more fuel. You've got to go through that same process all over again. I don't think he would have been clairvoyant enough to know that the APU was just going to spill gas everywhere and start a fire. So I don't know if waiting until a following season would have made a difference. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments here. I mean, that's something we could debate all day long. Thank you, SS America. Oh, her running mate. Okay, yeah. So, yeah, thanks for clearing that up, Matt. I just saw the picture, so I had to ask. Let's see. Can you speak more about Rick's death? Yeah, I can and I can't, you know, because even I don't know all the details. Even though I have talked to a lot of different people, I've read the book, I've talked to Rick's daughter, of course, Rick's wife. Rick's wife's name was Irene. In an earlier video, I apologize. I said her name was Tracy or Tammy, and that was incorrect. Rick's wife's name was Irene. And when I started to look for Irene, she had passed away like about 2 months before. So I just missed the opportunity to talk to her. But I did connect with Rick's daughter, Haley, and she was very generous with her time, you know, talked to me for about an hour and a half. In the book, Hunting Warbirds, there is, and Gavin makes a comment, got the book, been hounding through it. Yeah. In the book, if you haven't gotten to it already, Gavin, Carl Hoffman tells, it's about a paragraph. That's about it. Carl Hoffman mentions that they were loading one of the hydraulic jacks, and these things were absolutely huge. They were loading one of the hydraulic jacks, I believe, onto the Caribou. They were going to take it back to Thule. And what I'm talking about, let me get rid of JLA Forums comment here for a second. If you look right here, you see one of those hydraulic jacks, and they were brought up in 1993 to lift the Kee Bird off of its belly and get the landing gear down so that the Kee Bird could finally be sitting on the tires, the wheels, so that they could eventually get it out of the lake, right? So this is one of those hydraulic jacks. I don't exactly know how much they weigh, but it's hundreds and hundreds of pounds. And they were putting one of these, as I understand it, based on the book, they were putting one of these into the Caribou. Carl Hoffman, and I have not talked to Bob Vanderveen about this, but Carl Hoffman tells the story that Bob Vanderveen, his grip on his part of the hydraulic jack slipped, and Rick was injured that way. I don't know if his back was hit or what, but that's the story that was told by Carl Hoffman, that Bob Vanderveen's grip had slipped and he dropped the hydraulic jack, resulting in Rick's injury. And it was a blood clot, apparently, that Rick died from. So Carl Hoffman writes, that's how that happened. There's other speculation that this was actually a blood disorder that Rick had been dealing with for quite a while. They do mention in the documentary that Rick had painkillers up there. Well, why would he have painkillers up there? He could have, if he was dealing with this problem, he could have radioed to Thule and whoever was flying up next, hey, bring some painkillers. But I think that this is something that Rick was probably dealing with for quite a while, that he had painkillers up there. The documentary mentions he's taking the painkillers, they're becoming ineffective. So I have a feeling this is something that Rick was dealing with. Do I know for sure? Will we ever know for sure? No. But those are the two stories that I'm aware of. Now, what I do want to do is go back into the interview that I have recorded with Haley. She did a Zoom call with me, and I'll eventually post that. I think she may have mentioned that, or she at least talks about the hospital stay. And I don't want to make this all about Rick, because that could probably be its own video. But what it boils down to is they flew Rick to the Inuit village, Kanak, and then from there they flew him to Montreal. Apparently, Rick's wife, Irene, was begging Daryl, look, get Rick back to the U.S. Get him into an American hospital. Get him into a better hospital. And Daryl said, no. According to the book, no. Daryl's going to be fine right where he is. We can't move him. And then, of course, he passes away. He dies. That obviously is a source of anger and frustration for Haley even to this day. So that's pretty much all I know. And it's a tough subject. All right, moving on. Let's see here. Let's see. So David talks about the Glacier Girl recovery. I think they go into a bit even discussing test firing the yeah. So Gary Larkins was very, very much involved with the recovery of Glacier Girl. And you're right. In the book, they and in one of the documentaries about Glacier Girl, they bring up one of the 50 cals, and they're able to fire it. They it's a single shot. They don't go into full machine gun mode, but they load a round or two and they fire the gun. And it's really impressive that they were able to do that. They pull this thing that, that's been encased in ice for, 45 years. Yeah, 40, almost 50 years. And they were able to get it to fire. So, yeah, that, you know what, after we exhaust the whole Kee Bird subject, Glacier Girl might have to be next. Either that, or it's going to be the Nova documentary, Hitler's Lost Submarine. I know quite a bit about that too. I've talked to, well, we won't get into that. Richie Kohler, who was one of the divers for Hitler's Lost Sub, the U-869. We might do that one next. Let's see. Lots of money was spent on the recovery, but in reality, it was a shoestring operation based on the scale of the task. Interesting point, David. In talking to Matt Jackson, who was there for the last season, I made that comment, or I asked him about the notion that this was underfunded. Let's just use that term. And he pushed back big time. He said, the idea, people will say that, it was all cobbled together. He said, no. He said that environment was awful. He said it was just so unforgiving, and it was just awful. You could have had millions and millions of dollars. Of course, this is back in the 1990s, right? You could, even back then, you could have had millions and millions of dollars, and you would have run into the same problems. So it all depends on who you talk to. Was it a shoestring operation, as David says here? You know what? I could definitely make that argument from a certain aspect to say, yeah, you know what? Shoestring operation, a lot of corners were cut. I could also stand on the other side of the argument and say, hey, you know what? It didn't matter, because Daryl made a comment in the British version of the documentary. He said, yeah, I made all kinds of mistakes, but even some of the new equipment that he had up there failed. That environment's no joke. So, on one hand, I could say, yeah, shoestring operation. On the other hand, it's like, you know what, no matter how hard you try, that environment, it was going to go kicking and screaming. So that's all. It's all a matter of opinion. Let's see. Rick, he must have been a gifted engineer. He was very gifted. Yeah. Matt, Daryl came across Rick while he was going to aviation mechanics school in Oklahoma, and he was definitely a standout. That's how they crossed paths, and that's how Rick ended up working for Daryl, because he was so gifted. Can you do a vid on the Caribou? Absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff we got to cover on the Caribou. You know, and you think the adventure of the Kee Bird, the Caribou flying up to the Kee Bird, is a crazy story. Wait till you hear what they had to do after the Kee Bird burned, what they had to do to get the Caribou off the Thule Air Force Base and fly it back to California. That story's, I mean, it's just as much of a nightmare, possibly even more, than the flights back and forth between Thule and the Kee Bird site. Getting the Caribou back from Thule to the US is just crazy. So yeah, we definitely got to talk about that. Let's see, San Francisco Bay, blood vessel breaking, causing internal bleeding could have, yeah, well, that's pretty much, well, not a blood vessel breaking. I think it was a blockage. But at the same time, there was internal bleeding. Now that I think about it, yeah, there definitely was internal bleeding. So not a blockage then. See, now my EMT training has to come through. Yeah, we got to learn more before I speculate. But yeah, thanks for the comment. Gavin says, what I can't understand is Daryl had no B29 time. Oh, man. I'm so glad you brought this up. Rick had no B29 flight engineer time. Why wasn't a CAF aircrew brought in to fly it out? Well, we know that Thad Doolin, and I'll pull up a picture of him in a little bit, but we know Thad Doolin was up there in the last season, and he was a commemorative Air Force flight engineer rated for the B-29 for Fifi. So for that last part, they had Thad Doolin. But the previous season, because Daryl expected to fly it out then in 3 to 4 weeks, after 3 to 4 weeks of work, swapping out the engine and the propellers. You know, in the last video that I posted, I asked the question, who would the co-pilot have been? And I was trying to speculate it. Well, the book actually spells it out. I just forgot, and we can get to that in a little bit. But I want to answer Gavin's question here. What I cannot understand is Daryl had no B-29 time. Well, hardly anybody had B-29 time unless you flew Fifi or Doc. Well, wait, no, Doc didn't exist back then. So it would have just been Fifi, right? Okay, so there were hardly any pilots that were rated. What we forget about Daryl, or what very few people knew about Daryl, is that he was such an accomplished pilot that he was essentially given permission by the FAA. I think it was by the FAA. He was unlimited by aircraft type. You know, in my flying, I was type rated for a Piper PA-28. That's all I could fly. You know, I'm not allowed to fly anything else unless I was certified in it. Daryl, on the other hand, the other end of the spectrum, like totally opposite for me. Daryl, on the other hand, he was unlimited. He flew the SR-71, the Blackbird. He flew the U-2. He flew anything. So he was given special permission, or he had a special certification. I don't even know how it works. I just remember reading about it somewhere that he was unlimited by type. So if anyone was going to get into the pilot seat of a B-29, and they were not one of those few people that were rated in the B-29 that flew like Fifi, for example, you know, why not Daryl? Gary Larkins, who was a pilot, he was a licensed pilot. He did not have that same type of rating. And Gary, of course, had the opinion of, I'm just going to take the plane apart and ship it back. So, so yeah, it's a good question, Gavin. You know, if you're reading the book, you already read the part about Thad Doolin, I'm sure, you know, so he was definitely involved. But as for flying, yeah, Daryl was it. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, we got a lot of good stuff here. I want to get to the next question. We talked about Asher Ward. You know, who had Daryl sold the airframe to? So this is a picture of Asher Ward, and I've talked to Asher Ward. No current photos, but this is a picture of him standing in front of his P-51 called called Poontang. Great name. Here is a more present day image of Poontang, but I don't have any present day pictures of Asher. But yeah, Asher was is an aircraft broker specialized in military aircraft. So that was one of Daryl's partners. Okay. Next question that I want to get to. Gus N out of Greensboro, North Carolina. Let me get Gavin, I'm getting your comment out of here. Okay. You mentioned that Daryl had 9,000 gallons of special gasoline prepared. Yes. 130 low lead, actually 9,500 gallons of 130 low lead that was specially refined out of an operation in New Jersey. That's like 160 drums, 55-gallon drums. So what happened to all those empty drums? So Gus is correct. That's a lot of drums. Okay. In this image here of the dozer, you can see some of those 55-gallon drums over here, if you can see my cursor. Daryl had, as I said a few moments ago, 9,500 gallons of 130 low lead aviation fuel specially prepared for the Kee Bird, because that's what those radial wasp engines required. 130 low lead, 110 wouldn't have cut it. And that's what, you're not going to run Jet A, but 130 low lead is what was required. 110 low lead, which is what you normally find at FBOs, wouldn't have cut it. Wouldn't have given them the power that those engines required to take off. So he had to have this fuel specially prepared. Now, what's crazy is that, we talk about the 55-gallon drums you see here. Up at the Kee Bird site, you see some more 55-gallon drums here. But that's not how the fuel made it to Thule. So once the 9,500 gallons, this is such a crazy story, and I'm gonna make it as short as possible. But once the 9,500 gallons of aviation fuel was prepared, they planned on just simply putting it on the ship, right? Just like everything else, just like the tires, the engines, the hoist, the dozer, and put it up on the ship and ship it up on that annual resupply run to Thule. The ship's captain took one look at the 9,500 gallons of 130 low lead aviation fuel and said, "Not on my ship. Nope, absolutely not. Unless you get a special container." I think it was like a larger ferry container. The captain says, "Absolutely not." Well, without the fuel, Daryl would have been screwed. So he was able to borrow, I think it was a 10,000 gallon ferry container from one of the National Guard wings, I think is how it worked. And it was up to Vernon, Rich, and I think Tommy Hauptman to transfer the fuel from how it was delivered. I forget how it was delivered. It might have shown up in 55-gallon drums. But before it made it on the ship, the captain said, no, it's got to be in this special tank. So they had to transfer all 9,500 gallons into this special tank. So that was a mess. And then once it made it up to Thule, once the ship made it to Thule, they had to then pump all of that fuel out of that container, which was going to be, sent back on the ship. Had to pump all that fuel out of that container into these 55-gallon drums that we see here. Now, Daryl didn't know that he had to have 55-gallon drums up there, right? Because he didn't know this fuel wasn't going to be allowed on the ship. So Vernon and Tommy Hauptman went all over Thule Air Force Base, and they grabbed every empty 55-gallon drum they could find, and they cleaned each one by hand. They hand scrubbed each one, and they were a mess. So they ended up, I think, with about 90 or 100 empty 55-gallon drums, and they had to then pump that fuel back into 55-gallon drums. And the only thing they had was a hand pump. except they found what's called a trash pump. And a trash pump is basically like a glorified sump pump that we might use at our house. It's used to pump wastewater, you know, whatever. It's not rated for fuel, and it's definitely not what's the term? It's definitely not, it's not rated for petroleum products, but it's also, well, basically explosion proof is what I'm trying to get at. There's a term for it. I forget what it is. So Vernon tells a story. It's like they're using this trash pump to transfer 9,500 gallons of aviation fuel back into 55-gallon drums. And of course, the Thule Colonel Cox, Lieutenant Colonel Cox, I forget, Colonel Cox, whatever, basically said, no, not just like the ship's captain said, no, not on my base. So they had to be like a mile off base transferring this fuel. And Vernon tells the story. It's like, it was a disaster. They thought they're going to blow themselves up using this trash pump. He and Tommy Hoffman are soaked in aviation fuel. The moisture's like stripped from his skin. It just sounds like a nightmare. So, Gus N, I hope that answers your question, because it is a hell of a story. I mean, it's just one challenge after another, right? To get this thing to get this expedition to work, you know. So yeah, it's a crazy story. Let's see here. Let's get back to some of your questions. We talked about Rick's death. David brought up the question about Glacier Girl. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to definitely do a video about the caribou. Todd makes a comment. So I just reread my late dad's copy of the book Hunting Warbirds. It describes the team's final departure from the site of the caribou. That was a herring tale. Okay, yeah. The information that I have about it comes more from the NOVA crew. So I've talked to three of the members. There were 4 members to the NOVA crew, and I've talked to 3 of them. I've also talked to Carl Hoffman, who was, well, he was up there. He was the writer. And I've also talked to Tim Wright, who was a photographer that was also up there. And okay. So here's one aspect of the story. If you think about the expedition, you're talking about Daryl, you're talking about Roger Von Groot, who flew the caribou, Bob Vanderveen, you're talking about Rick and his assistant Cecilio. Wait, Daryl, Roger, Rick, Cecilio, Bob, and Vernon Rich. So so the 6 of them, okay? That's who we see primarily in the quote-unquote first season of the NOVA documentary. 6 people, okay? But when it comes to, and you know, Todd's asking the question about that final flight of the caribou, you think it's just going to be the 6 of them on the caribou, right? Flying out there at the last minute after they get that cylinder replaced on the right engine. It's not. It's a lot more than that, okay? So in addition to the 6 for this flight, you know, which Todd calls it a harrowing tale, no doubt about it. But there's more than just 6 people on that plane. You had the 4 NOVA crew. Now you're up to 10. You had Carl Hoffman and Tim Wright. Now you're up to 12, right? Who am I forgetting? There's 2 other people that okay. So then we're going to get to those last 2. There were 2 other people that we don't know about. You know, Todd, if you read the book, Gavin's reading the book, whoever's reading the book, Carl also mentions there were 2 other people up there. And this kind of gets to my question in my last video. If you saw that post, it's like, well, who was going to be Daryl's co-pilot? In addition to Asher Ward, Daryl had another partner, a guy by the name of Tom Hess. And that's where a lot of the money came from. You know, a lot of people will say, and I've said it before, you know, Daryl, it was self-funded out of Daryl's pocket. Yes and no. Daryl did fork over a good chunk of money, but he also had another partner, a guy by the name of Tom Hess, who was a neighbor of Daryl's. And Tom Hess was up there. Tom Hess was going to be the co-pilot. If the Kee Bird was ready to go, Tom Hess was going to be the co-pilot. I don't know the extent of Tom's aviation experience, but yeah, so he was going to be the co-pilot. And then the 14th person on the Caribou getting out of there, you know, because now we're up to 13, right? Tom Hess. The 14th person, believe it or not, was Daryl's dad. Daryl's dad was up there during this part of the expedition. We didn't know anything about it. And apparently he was freezing the whole time. He was huddled up in his sleeping bag. He didn't come out of his tent. He was miserable. Of course, the guy's in his 80s, right? So there were 14, not 6. There were 14 people that were on the Caribou that day. So that's one aspect that they don't talk about in the documentary. Now, I touched on this in my last video that I posted, I think 2 days ago, part 3 of my review of Treasure of the Humboldt Glacier, the British version of the documentary. Lawrence Dodds, I included some of the interview that I had with Lawrence, and he talks about what a nightmare that flight was, because they had to get all of their footage, all of their sound recordings out with that flight. You know, it wasn't digital. They didn't have digital video back then. Everything was film, and they had hundreds of pounds of film. They had hundreds of pounds of camera equipment, recording equipment that they had to take back with them. And they're airborne. They lost an engine, and now people are saying, yeah, we got to lose weight, get rid of stuff, you know. So they open up the back ramp door of the Caribou, and they almost threw out all of the footage. And Mike Rossiter, the Nova director and producer, said, no, we can't do that. So there was that aspect of it. The other thing that I can say is, and then I'll move on to another question. The other thing I can say is, when they lost that right engine, the left engine actually was still running really, really well. And they were still able to gain some altitude even on one engine. So, you know, flying over the tundra of Greenland, what a nightmare, right? You know, to lose an engine. But they were actually in pretty good shape, probably because the temperature of the air, you know, the air was so dense that they were able to make it in. So yeah, I mean, it's a crazy story. You know, they can't include all of those details in a documentary that's only 55 minutes long. I get it. But yeah, you know, you talk to these guys, you talk to the Nova crew, you hear about, you know, yeah, we almost didn't get to see this documentary. If you think about it, we almost didn't get to see it because they almost had to throw all of the footage out the back of the plane. And yeah, well, thankfully they didn't have to do that. Todd, thanks for the question. Let's see. You know what? Matt and Gavin ask similar questions. You know, I wonder what some of the surviving crew from 1947 must have thought about the tragic fire. I don't know the answer to that question, but that's a very good question. Yeah, I don't know. I wish I did. I'll have to look through my stuff and see if I can find something, look through my notes. But right now, off the top of my head, I don't have an answer for you. But Matt, thanks for the question. Yeah, Chowhound, that was you that asked the question about the Marston mats. You know, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I think you posted that question in the comments, if I'm not mistaken. You had raised the issue about, yeah, they used Marston mats all over the place in the Pacific during World War II. Marston mats, if you're not aware, it's like a mesh. Well, it's not like a mesh, but it's a metal matting. Yeah, it's kind of like a mesh that they put down on island runways in World War II to make them more stable for the aircraft, especially for the bombers. Well, those Marston mats were brought to the island via ship. And you think about the length of the runway that Darrell was trying to prepare way above the Arctic Circle. It was 5,000 feet long. And that's a lot of Marston mats to not bring by ship, but to fly in the Caribou. It just wouldn't have been feasible to do, but how, you got to ask the question, he's dealing with soggy waterlogged runway. There's bogs everywhere. Marston mats would have been the perfect solution, right? And yeah, you just couldn't get all of them in the Caribou. You would have made 10, 15 flights just hauling Marston mats, I suppose, probably even more than that. Let's see. Yeah, Dreamland 051 saw Glacier Girl fly several times. Crazy story. Yeah, but Gary Larkins had his hands on that one too. Gary Larkins he's just an amazing character. If there is a warbird that can be recovered, he knows about it. And he was involved in Glacier Girl. Let's see. David says, I don't know if you can exhaust the Kee Bird. Yeah. So you knew about it from the article in Air Classics from the 80s. See, I didn't know about the Kee Bird until the documentary came out. And I want to believe, the way I recall, it was a Monday evening when it was first aired on Nova. And that would have been in 1996. And I'll never forget, I was just, flipping channels, whatever, and I came across this thing and I watched it. I was lucky enough to watch it from pretty much the very beginning of the episode. And at the end of the episode, I was shocked. Of course, everybody was. And I picked up the phone and I called my dad. I said, you won't believe what I just saw on PBS. And he said, about the bomber? And I'm going, he was watching the same thing. It was just, I mean, my night came to a standstill when the documentary ended. So David knew about it in the 80s. I had no clue. I wasn't even into flying back then. I didn't get into flying until 2000. So I wasn't really much of an enthusiast, but boy, did I saw that documentary in 96, and yeah, that was something else. Let's see. Oh yeah, you're right about. Okay, so Matt makes a comment about Arnett, the pilot. He was killed in another cold weather wreck. Matt says it was another B29. Well, that makes sense. I can't remember if it was a B29, but of course he's a B29 pilot, so I'm sure he was flying it. And yeah, so that's how Arnett died. But there was the flight engineer. His last name was Ludke. He was, I think the Kee Bird was his second or third. I'm just going to use the word crash. It was a belly landing and everything. But so, yeah, there was several of those crew members were involved in multiple incidents. Crazy story. Talking about the Glacier Girl being so deep really challenges the concept of ice core samples. Yeah, no doubt about it when it comes to historical analysis. There's even another story about a Coast Guard. So in the history of the U.S. Coast Guard, there are 2 Coast Guard servicemen still unaccounted for. And they are involved in a rescue mission trying to rescue the crew of a B-17 that went down in Greenland. And they were flying. I'm not prepared for this and everything, but I'll tell you just a quick story. And they were flying a Grumman Duck, which is an amphibious plane that was launched from a Coast Guard cutter, the Northland. And they were looking for this B-17. And they found the B-17 crew, and they were starting to fly the members back. And then all of a sudden the plane disappeared. They never heard from the plane again. And so there's another group that's been trying, just like Glacier Girl, they've been trying to find the Grumman Duck, the remains of the 2 Coast Guard members and the one of the crew members from the B-17. So 3 guys were lost, never heard from the plane again. And they're digging core samples, just like what you're talking about, ice core samples, looking for the plane. Can't find it. So Yeah, that's the Kee Bird is an exception because it literally was not on a glacier, but it was next to one. So the Kee Bird, unlike Glacier Girl, well, the whole Lost Squadron, the 6 P-38s and the 2 B-17 bombers that went down when they ran out of fuel, you know, they were under 280 feet of ice, right? The Grumman Duck with the Coast Guard, you know, under all that ice. There are all kinds of planes that went down in Greenland during Operation Bolero, you know, flying aircraft back and forth for Operation Bolero during World War II that are under hundreds and hundreds of feet of ice, but not the Kee Bird because it was in that particular area that wasn't consumed by the glacier. Really strange. Let's see. You guys, a lot of great questions and a lot of great comments. Hey, thanks, Scott. Smash that like button, subscribe as well. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, if you guys haven't subscribed yet, just a quick note. I don't, in a lot of my videos, I don't really make the comment, hey, subscribe, smash the like button. I don't do a lot of that. But if you want, I'm going to be doing a lot more videos. So if you do want to receive notifications about when the next Kee Bird video is going to come out, even like this Q&A, then you might want to subscribe so that you at least get those notifications. Are there any other recoverable aircraft in the frozen areas of the Earth? Yeah, the short answer is there's tons of them. The problem is, can you find them? And, we talked about that Grumman Duck during World War II. There are just tons of them. And, a lot of them are in Greenland, but other areas, I gotta believe, so the answer, Alex, great question. The other area is the Himalayas in Asia. So they called it the Himalayan hump, and I know a lot of planes went down there as well. So now you're talking about high altitude frozen areas of the Earth rather than the plains of like Greenland, right? Totally different area, but that would be another area as well, I would think. Let's see. Dreamland 051 says the standard in California is 100 low lead. Okay, yeah, I didn't know that. So the story of the fuel, or I should say the fuel, is a story in and of itself. And in the last video that I just posted a couple of days ago, we talked about how that Cessna 172 came in the quote unquote rescue delivery mission. Well, that was a 250-mile flight, so it had to be refueled. And I was questioning whether refueling it with 130 low lead would hurt the engine, an engine designed for 110. And a couple of you made the comment and said, no, it not just for that one flight, it wouldn't have hurt it. Oh, yeah. No, David, I appreciate, no disrespect, but we all made that assumption, right? Shoestring operation. And I even posed that question to Matt Jackson when I was talking to him. It's like, well, what about this idea of a shoestring? Yeah. So no, I don't think you meant any disrespect at all. I actually appreciated the question. Yeah, Paul Allen, looking for all of the shipwrecks before he passed away. Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, had this desire to find as many World War II shipwrecks as he could, and he put a lot of money into it, including, I think I think one of his main ships was the RV research vessel Petrel. Yeah, so yeah, this wasn't a Paul Allen type of operation, was it? But again, like I said before, you really have to question, at some point, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at a project. It doesn't matter how many resources you throw at a project. The law of diminishing returns, right? It's not going to make a difference. And I think that environment, an argument could be made that it's like the great equalizer. Yeah, I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how many people you have. I don't care how much of anything that you have. The Arctic is going to push back. And, the argument could definitely be made that that's what happened here. Let's see. Yeah, San Francisco Bay, he had the F-104 Starfighter. And that low altitude speed record still stands, as I understand it, still stands to this day. And of course, yeah, he did have to eject and the plane crashed. That story is also covered in the book, partially covered in the book, but then there's another there's a documentary. One of you guys sent me a link or told me about it in the comments about Daryl at the Reno air races that I looked at. I'm gonna have to look that up and post that for you guys. You might enjoy. Yeah, Matt, have to go now. Hey, thanks for your comments. Read a story about the Caribou being damaged in a tornado and scrapped in 98. Yes, it was damaged in a storm and it was scrapped. I don't know if it was 98 or 2000, 2002. I think though it was damaged in a storm in Florida and then scrapped right where it sat. In a earlier, I think it was an earlier Q&A, I posted some pictures of the Kee Bird. I'm sorry, the Caribou. All the paint had been stripped off. All the green paint had been stripped off. And it was like a shiny aluminum. Someone had spray painted the tail number in black spray paint. It was a sad sight. We're going to have to definitely do a separate video about the Caribou. Oh, let's see. Yeah, you guys, just great comments. Let's see. Talked about the Starfighter, Daryl's F-104 Starfighter. Yeah, and talk about the crew member. Yeah, that was Lieutenant John Nessman, I think his name was. Nessman. He was one of the navigators that was on board the Caribou. And yeah, in the documentary, he makes the comment, he's got mixed feelings about them recovering it. But I'm not sure. I know the co-pilot Russell Jordan had passed away before the Kee Bird disaster. He was interviewed in the documentary, but if you look, you'll notice next to his name it said deceased. So he passed away after he was interviewed. I don't believe he was alive when the Kee Bird burned to the ground. But there had to be a couple of other guys. How they felt about it, I'm sure they were not happy. But I don't have any recorded interviews or anything like that. Yes, I do believe I got your email with the link for the Caribou manual because I think I was clicking on it. I haven't actually gone through the Caribou manual yet, but I want to. So yeah, Amnuk, thank you very much. Your support either for these Kee Bird Q&As or Museum Ship Mafia that we do, your support is always appreciated. It's always good to see your name. I would have put any tires on other than what was on it. Oh, wait, hold on a second. So, Ole Eric Buholth, was the tire work necessary? I've been wondering that too. You know, nylon tires from a boneyard, a lot of work. You look at the amount of work that they had to put into each tire, breaking the bead off of that rim, because those were not split rims. Those were solid rims. And yeah, because there is a rim design that that's split in half and you can separate them that way, but these rims were not like that. And we all saw how hard it was to get the bead broken on those tires, right? So I've been wondering about this. Was all of that tire work necessary? Because the tires from 1946, 47, well, the plane was built in 45. So those tires were rayon. And Daryl makes the comment that he wanted to replace the tires. And okay, so he asked that question because I've been wondering the same thing. It's like, really, did they really have to do that? Was that really necessary? And Scott answers, I would have put any tires on other than what was on it, just because of the age, right? The age of the tires, being exposed to that cold weather, the extended temperature swings, 50 some years worth of temperature swings. Yeah, they were probably in bad shape. But I've been wondering the same thing. Good question. Good question. Let's see. Going on to what else do I have lined up for you guys? Okay. Okay. I Now we're already at an hour, but I made a mistake or I misspoke and made an error in an earlier video that I want to correct. And it was with the help of Lorenzo A. I'm gonna get Eric's. Okay. So Lorenzo A sent me an email, and I definitely appreciate him doing this because I was under the assumption that, let's see, where do I begin? I forget what video it was, but I was talking about, so the 1993 expedition, which is not covered in the NOVA documentary or the British version of the documentary, Treasure on the Humboldt Glacier. The 1993 expedition, they went up there to see if the plane was salvageable. And I made the assumption, looking back, that's really all it was. They must have removed the rudder to see what was required to recover it. Lorenzo sent me this email, and I'm glad he did. He says, the Kee Bird's rudder was missing in 1994. Okay. And you said that it was removed. Yes. By the 6 guys who went up there in 1993. Yes, that's what I said. However, Lorenzo points out the 1985 photos taken by Giles Kershaw, I think. No, Giles Kershaw was 1987. So it must have been like a flyover in 1985. The 1985 photos of the Kee Bird show the rudder was already off. And this is what, okay, so in the beginning of the documentary, when they get up there, we all see, this is Bob Vanderveen right here. You know, they get off the Caribou, they get out of the Caribou, and they quickly, Bob checks out the rudder because that's going to be one of his jobs, is recovering the rudder. So he, you know, he's checking that out. This is all stuff that was left in a pile after the 1993 visit by Daryl, Gary Larkins, you know, when they flew up there in the Huey helicopter. I thought they had removed the rudder, but that's not the case. And this is what Lorenzo helped me with. So he sent me this picture. Actually, no. So he sent me this picture of the Kee Bird sitting in the lake. And apparently this was taken in 1985. Clearly, the rudder's missing. So that's where I made the mistake, and I want to straighten this up. They did not remove the rudder in 1993. It was already, it had been ripped off. And you can see right here. But Lorenzo goes on. He also says, so here's a picture of a B29 sitting at China Lake. And, you know, rudder's missing. But take a look. So these are the I forget what they're called, the hinge mounts, the rudder mounts, whatever. And there's 2 points of contact for the rudder. So he sent me this picture, nice enough to send me this. And he says, take a look. The Kee Bird was missing one of its attachment points, one of its hinges. And clearly it was ripped off high wind or maybe just metal fatigue. Anyway, I thought that was very interesting, and it helps to correct a mistake that I had made about the rudder. So if you guys had seen that other video where I said it was a 1993 expedition, it was not. It had been ripped off or removed, well, ripped off as early as 1985, according to these images here. Lorenzo also went on to ask the question, so who was inside when the Kee Bird caught fire? Now, I'm going to be doing another couple of review episodes on the NOVA version of the documentary, B29 Frozen in Time. And we're going to get to that last season up there. Snow's everywhere. Plane catches on fire, burns to the ground. But I'm going to answer this question anyway. Lorenzo, who was inside when the Kee Bird caught fire? Well, we know Daryl was going to be flying, right? In the documentary, you also see Thad Doolin, the flight engineer from the Commemorative Air Force, So Thad, Daryl, but there were two other people that were in the Kee Bird at the time that it caught fire. Let me get my image out of the way. So there were 4 people on board. We talked about Daryl, and we talked about Thad Doolin. Okay. The other people that were on the plane at the time were Bob Vanderveen, who was recovering the rudder and other control surfaces with fabric. He was also serving as the cook up there. Bob was in the back of the plane with the APU when it caught fire. So then, all right, who was the 4th person? Well, this guy right here, he's briefly referred to in the Nova documentary, B29 Frozen in Time. He was up there with that last group of people. This is a guy by the name of Al Hansen. And Al was in the co-pilot seat next to Daryl. He's a friend of Daryl's. And he was in the co-pilot seat when the fire started. So there were 4 people on board. Bob, his job in the back of the plane was to keep an eye on the 4 engines, the back of the 4 engines, and look for any kind of smoke or flames. Thad Doolin, being the flight engineer, also doing that, of course, but he can't keep an eye on all the engines all at once because he's only looking at one. So Bob Vanderveen was in the back of the plane doing that. He did not have a headset. He was in the back of the plane next to the APU. He did not have a headset. And I forget how he would have signaled if he saw a fire. Well, I think because they were only supposed to be taxiing and moving the plane, they weren't going to be taking off. I think it was more of an observation thing. Hey, yeah, I saw some smoke on engine number 3, you know, got to take care of that. Anyway, that was why he was back there. So to answer Lorenzo's question, who was inside when the Kee Bird caught fire? It was Bob, Daryl, Thad Doolin, and Al Hansen. I've actually had an opportunity to talk to Al's wife, Kathy. Al Hansen, unfortunately, is no longer alive, but talked to his wife, Kathy Hansen. She was nice enough to give me her collection of VHS videos of the Kee Bird expedition. You know, it included the 1993 footage of them flying the Huey helicopter up there. It included Al, you know, all the footage that Al recorded while he was up there, not only just prior to getting the Kee Bird to move, but actually while, you know, after it caught fire and burning the ground. So I've got all of that. Kathy was nice enough to share that with me. And I've posted some of that. When I was doing some videos a couple of years ago, I used some of her footage, and there's a lot more. So yeah, so those are the 4 guys that were on. I always made the assumption that there at takeoff there would have been a Nova cameraman on there as well, but in this particular case there was not. Let's see here. Okay, so that's the extent of the questions that I wanted to pull from the emails that I wanted to mention to you guys tonight. But let's dig into some of your other comments here. Let's see. So we talked about the tires a little bit. Yeah, Amnuck, I did get your email. So we talked about, yeah, we need to talk about Bob, Bob Vanderveen. We won't do that tonight, but we are definitely going to have him on. I talked to him as recently as about a month ago, and he wants to come on and answer questions, tell his side of the story, which Gavin is referring to. If you read the book, Carl Hoffman's book, Hunting Warbirds, he doesn't speak too highly of Bob. And I don't know if that was from a personality conflict or whatever, but I definitely would like to get to the bottom of it. Bob is as I've talked to him on the phone, he's very forthcoming. You know, he sent me a box of stuff, so he's a very generous guy, very interesting guy. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing his side of the story. Matter of fact, one of the photos, I really appreciate, he sent me a bunch of photos, images that Bob had taken while they were up there. I should scan these so you guys can see them, but I mean, great stuff. And he signed one of them. He says, to Ken, thanks for your fine videos. You help get the truth out. And I think that's what Bob wants to do. Bob's not an author. So Carl Hoffman writing this book, which I absolutely love. I'm always pulling his book into the picture, right? Because it's fascinating. But those are Carl's observations. Carl couldn't have been everywhere at once. So Bob Vanderveen has his own story to tell. Let's see. Red deer, Rick's red jacket turning black with oil towards the, yeah. Definitely. I'm going to get my image out of the way because even look at Daryl's jacket right here. Look at that. There's oil. I mean, there's no disguising that. He got sprayed with oil. They all did, I suppose. I mean, yeah. What's ironic, reading Red Deer's comment, Rick's red jacket turning black with oil towards the end, an image of a hardworking man battling time and elements. Hard to erase that image. Yeah. Daryl's got the jacket here, but Rick definitely took the brunt of it. But believe it or not, and I think it might have been mentioned in the book, Rick was actually, before he got into aviation, he worked in the oil fields of, where was that? Might have been Montana. I can't remember. So he was an oil man before he was an aviation mechanic. No stranger to oil, but he sure was covered in it, wasn't he? Let's see. McKay 747. Hey, I remember your comments from couple weeks ago. Yeah, thanks for coming back on. Do we know why Daryl taxied the B29 like Baja 1000 trophy truck? I kind of do, as it's explained to me. Might have been Vernon Rich. No, it wasn't Vernon, because Vernon was not up there at the time when the Kee Bird burned, but Bob Vanderveen was. And Bob Vanderveen reminded me that the B-29 bomber, the nose gear is not steerable. The nose gear, okay, so like my plane, you would steer the nose gear with the rudder pedals. There was a connection there, and that's the way many aircraft is. That's the way many aircraft are designed. B-29, and I think the Caribou also had what's called castering nose wheel. It had a castering nose wheel, meaning as the plane is moving forward, the nose. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, you didn't see me. So as the plane is moving forward, the nose gear just always stays straight. So when Daryl started moving, the only way he could steer the plane into the direction he wanted to go was by engine power initially. And we all see that iconic shot where the Kee Bird, once it breaks free of the snow and ice and begins to move, it slams down on its nose gear. The shocks, the struts had no fluid in them whatsoever. It slams down, and he needs that plane to start moving with some type of speed so that nose gear starts running true, right? And so I believe, to answer your question, or I believe that might be part of the reason why he did that. He needed to gain some speed so he would have some control over that nose gear. I agree with you. It looks like it's a Baja 1000 trophy truck, right? It was definitely an uneven surface. And like I said a few moments ago, none of the struts, none of the shocks had any fluid in them whatsoever. The plane also didn't have brakes, by the way. Matt Jackson explained that to me. The plane had no brakes, there were no shocks, no struts, and it was literally riding with those struts bottomed out. And so that's why the plane is just bouncing all over the place. And oh, by the way, Bob Vanderveen, take a look at that video. Take a look at that documentary. I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna be doing yet another session, because we haven't talked about that. We got a lot of work to do yet. We haven't talked about that part of the documentary, but you see that plane bouncing around, and you see how aggressively that tail is moving. That's where Bob Vanderveen was, and that's where the APU was, splashing gas everywhere. Bob Vanderveen's flying around in the back of that tail, and he's telling the story. You know, we forget, or we don't realize that the Kee Bird was sitting in that sitting at the bottom of that lake for 50 years, and the sediment and the mud and the dirt that ran into the fuselage over those decades settled into the plane. Well, they get it on its landing gear, they pull it out of the lake, they put the new engines on there, they start it up. They didn't take the time to dig all of that dirt and dust out of there. So Bob's telling me the story. It's like, yeah, I'm flying all over the place. He's not belted in or strapped in. He's literally airborne, getting slammed around. And the dirt and dust is just starting to float everywhere. It's flying all over the place. So now he can't breathe, and now he can't see. And it just was a total nightmare. But you know what? You don't want me to tell the story. You want him to tell you the story, because it's just awful. So that, I don't know if that doesn't necessarily answer that last part, doesn't answer your question, but it relates to your question. You know, what was the result of him running around as quickly as he was while he was taxiing? It just created so many problems. Let's see. That's a damn good idea. I might have to do a giveaway. Yeah, I might have to do a giveaway. So Bob's hat, this is what they had. This is what Daryl prepared. I don't have the t-shirt down here. The t-shirt, it's actually upstairs, but so Bob also sent me a t-shirt. And yeah, I might have to. So the other hat that Bob Vanderveen sent me relates to the 46th Recon. This is so the 46th Recon, that's what the Kee Bird was part of. And so this hat, I think, was made for possibly a reunion. I can't remember. And then there's other stuff in here as well. I mean, just it's just amazing how generous Bob was. Yeah, but yeah, you know, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that. Raffling off one of the hats. Yeah, no brakes on the Kee Bird. They don't talk about that. Carl Hoffman didn't mention in the book, because I don't think Carl knew about that. The struts, no oil or fluid in them. So think about what it'd be like to drive your car around with no shock absorbers. You know, no functioning struts, no brakes. That was the Kee Bird. Let's see. Yeah. You also make the comment, you know, of course, the Caribou loses its nose. The tires on the nose gear are forced off the rim because Darrow was taxiing the Caribou, and the nose gear went sideways. Yeah. So yeah, that confirms it. The Caribou did also have a castering nose gear, and it went sideways, and the tires got forced off. We all know that scene where Rick has to reinflate them with propane. Let's see. Sounds like Bob was lucky not to catch fire with all the sloshing gasoline. Huh. Yeah. You know, let's go back to this image here. And I'm going to get myself out of the way. I'm sorry for keeping you guys on longer, but you know, I could talk about this for hours, but so Amnuk, sounds like Bob was lucky not to catch fire with all the sloshing around. Yes. In addition to the gasoline and the dust and the dirt that was flying around, The insulation on the B29, I believe was cotton. I think that's what he said. The insulation was cotton. So you had this gas flying all the way all around. I have a short video that I made a couple years ago about the setup that they had to make the fuel pump on the APU. Oh, by the way, the APU, that was not the original APU on the Kee Bird. Believe it or not, the APU, that was a replacement that was flown up there. It was actually FedExed, I think. I think Bob said it was FedExed to Thule because they could not repair the APU, or the APU was missing, or beyond repair or something like that. So anyway, that's a side story. So anyway, the fuel pump on the APU wasn't working, so they had to mount a gas can and gravity feed fuel to the APU. And this gas can's so I'm sorry. So yeah, they mount this tank or this gas can above the APU, and that's shaking around, and it's gas is going everywhere. And it of course splashes on this cotton insulation, thermal insulation in the Kee Bird, and just goes up like a match. So apparently, as Bob tells the story, he literally had to jump out the hatch that he was close to. When the Kee Bird starts moving in the documentary, there's a brief second you see Bob sticking out of the hatch with a video camera. Brief second. He had to jump out of that hatch. Additionally, Thad Doolin, this guy right here, not a small guy, pretty big guy, he had a hard time getting out as well, just because of his size. So he had a hard time getting out. And then Al Hansen apparently had problems with the buckle of the seatbelt. He was trapped also. So Amnuck makes the comment, sounds like Bob was lucky not to catch fire with all the sloshing gasoline. Absolutely. But these guys also had a hard time. Thad Doolin had a hard time getting out, and Al Hansen had a hard time getting out because of his seatbelt. I think they had to get a screwdriver or a wrench or something to force it open. Crazy story. Crazy story. Let's see. That's just crazy not taking out the dirt. Yeah, you know, I don't want to make it sound like it was I don't want to make it sound like it was 2 or 3 feet of dirt, you know, because that's just weight, right? They're getting rid of the 50 calibers, they're pulling out flooring and everything to save weight. But there was considerable layers of sediment just everywhere, and that's what was floating around in the air. So yeah, Scott, please don't misunderstand me. I don't want to make it sound like it was like 2 or 3 feet of dirt sitting in the fuselage. It wasn't like that at all, but it was enough to just create these clouds that, you know, would choke off your oxygen, make it hard to see, all of that. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, no hydraulics, no brakes. The reason why I'm asking is you would think that a pilot as accomplished as Daryl would have maybe give a detailed brief about the threats of the day and keep everyone involved 100% in the loop. Yeah, you would. But when I was talking to cameraman Lawrence Dodds, or even Matt Jackson, who was one of the mechanics that was up there that last season, they had no idea. Lawrence Dodds, the cameraman, he was like 100 yards away. He was getting shots from a distance of the plane moving, you know, the whole campsite, the plane moving. But he was not in a position, if the Nova crew knew that Daryl was going to be taking off, he would have been in a totally different spot. Like, say, maybe the end of the runway, but he wasn't. He was just way out of position. Matt Jackson, he wasn't expecting Daryl to try and take off because his tools were still in the plane. So, yeah, McCoy 7747 makes a very good point. You would think Daryl would have clued everybody in. I think, but you know, then you have to wonder, it's like, well, hey, wait a second. Is he feeling the plane out? And it's like, hey, this feels pretty good. I'm feeling a lot of power. I'm going to go right now. And it could have been that situation. I will never know, right? All right, guys, everybody, thank you for tuning in tonight. We are now at an hour and a half. I apologize for going over, for keeping you guys longer than I have, but stay tuned for I'm looking for, wait, hold on a second. What would be a good, yeah, we'll just, okay. Anyway, stay tuned it'll probably be about, let's see, today's Wednesday. Might be about another week or so before I get another episode out reviewing. This time it'll be going back to the Nova documentary B29 Frozen in Time. I've totally gone through the British version of the documentary. Of course, there's all kinds of additional footage in there. We learn a lot, but now we've got to take what we've learned and go back to the Nova documentary B29 Frozen in Time and help to put some of the pieces together, right? Piece together the Caribou, the last flight of the Caribou, as well as the last season of them being up there. So that's going to be some of the next stuff that I put together for you guys. Of course, we'll be doing other Q&As. I'm going to be getting other people involved. So please stay tuned. And in the meantime, send me, I'll pull up my email address. Don't hesitate to send me an email with your questions, your comments, anything. Of course, putting questions and comments attached to each video, that works too, because I read each and every one of them. But also, feel free to send me an email, and I'll try and respond as quickly as I can, and give you my opinions and what I know. I'm happy to do it. I love hearing from you guys. You guys ask a lot of great questions. So let's see. With that being said, I'll just say good night to everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good Wednesday evening.